My parents invited me to dinner only to ambush me with my estranged sister, hoping I'd forgive her for what she did years ago. Instead, I walked out and let them realize that some betrayals can't be undone. I thought I was just going to a normal family dinner, but what happened that night was anything but. My parents, who I hadn't seen in months, invited me over to their house under the guise of a casual get-together. It had been years since we'd all sat down together, and despite everything that had happened, I was willing to put the past behind me, until I walked into that room. There, sitting at the table, was my estranged sister. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the incident, the one that tore our family apart. The one that I never thought I'd be able to forgive. But my parents were hoping for a miracle. They thought that if they brought us together, some long-forgotten sense of family love would just magically heal all the wounds. What they didn't realize was that some betrayals are far too deep to ever be erased by a simple apology. As soon as I saw her sitting there, that familiar knot of anger and pain twisted in my stomach. They had set this up, hoping I'd open my heart, pretend nothing ever happened, and welcome her back into my life. But the truth is, what she did still haunts me, and no amount of forced reconciliation was going to change that. I could feel the tension building, the pressure to give in, to let it all go. But I couldn't. So I did the one thing I knew would make them see the truth. I walked out. It wasn't a dramatic exit. It was quiet, deliberate, exactly what they deserved. They had to face the reality that some things can never be forgiven. But did they get it? You'll have to stay tuned to find out. As I stood outside their house, feeling the cold air against my skin, I could hear my parents' voices behind me, rising in confusion and disbelief. They probably thought I would just come back inside, sit down, and pretend everything was fine. But the truth was, I couldn't just move on. What my sister did, what she took from me, was something I couldn't just forget. The story started years ago when we were both a little younger and, I guess, a little more naive. I had always been close to my sister, even with the rivalry that exists between siblings. We shared a bond that I thought would last forever. But then everything changed. One night I came home early from a trip, ready to surprise my family. Instead, I was the one who got the shock of my life. I walked in to find my sister in my fiancé's arms, sharing a kiss I never thought I'd see. It was the betrayal that no one ever prepares for. The kind that leaves you questioning everything you once believed. To make it worse, when I confronted them, neither of them apologized. Instead, they acted as though it was some sort of misunderstanding, that nothing really happened. My fiancé, who I thought was the love of my life, blamed me for not being around more. My sister just sat there silent with no remorse. What followed was a slow, painful unraveling. I broke off my engagement. I stopped speaking to my sister. My parents, caught in the middle, tried to play peacemakers, but I couldn't forgive either of them. They didn't get it. They didn't understand how deeply I was hurt, how everything I had planned, everything I thought was real, was shattered in an instant. Months passed. My sister reached out a few times, leaving messages asking to talk. But I ignored them. She never truly apologized. She never seemed to understand why I couldn't just move on. My parents tried to pressure me into reconciling, saying things like, "You're family. You'll regret not forgiving her one day." But they didn't get it. They couldn't possibly understand the depth of betrayal. And then there was the night of the dinner invitation. I knew something was off the moment I walked in and saw the way they were all looking at me. My parents were too calm, too eager, as though they were waiting for some sort of miracle. But when I saw my sister sitting there, her eyes almost pleading, her lips twisted into that familiar half-smile, I knew exactly what was going on. They had planned this. They had hoped that by forcing me to sit at the same table as her, I would magically forgive and forget. But no matter how much they wanted it, no matter how much they wished for it, some things can't be undone. I was never going to forgive my sister for what she did. But it wasn't just her. It was the fact that my parents had allowed it to happen, that they had sided with her instead of understanding why I was so hurt. That moment when I walked out felt like the culmination of years of silence, pain, and unresolved anger. I wasn't just walking out on my sister. I was walking out on everything I had once believed in, my family, the idea that time could heal wounds, and the belief that forgiveness could fix everything. The truth was, there was no coming back from this. The damage had been done, and my parents had to face the reality that no amount of forcing me to reconcile would fix what had been broken. Maybe in time they would realize the truth. But for now I was done. As I drove away from their house, I felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't relief. It wasn't peace. It was more like the stillness before a storm. I wasn't sure what would happen next. But I knew one thing for certain. The past was never going to be erased, and my family would have to live with that truth that the betrayal had cut. They thought I was just angry, that it was something I'd eventually get over. But the truth was it wasn't about the act itself, it was what it said about them. How could I trust anyone again if the people closest to me could betray me like that? And even worse, my sister seemed so unapologetic. It wasn't just that she'd hurt me. It was that she didn't even seem to care. Time passed, but the scars remained. The awkward family gatherings became unbearable. I couldn't face her, and my parents couldn't understand why. "It's been years, honey," they'd say. "Don't you think it's time to move on? Life's too short for grudges." But for me, it wasn't a grudge. It was the fact that they didn't even see what had happened. It wasn't just about love. It was about respect. My sister had crossed a line that couldn't be erased with a simple apology or a forced dinner. I tried to move on. I started therapy, tried to rebuild my life, tried to find happiness without them. But every so often, a memory would pop up, like a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. I saw their faces, my sister's smug expression, and the way my ex-fiancé had acted like I was the one being unreasonable. It felt like my entire world had been turned upside down. Then, months later, my parents reached out to me again. This time, they didn't just ask me to dinner, they insisted. They told me it was important. "It's time, don't you think?" my mom said over the phone. "Your sister has been through a lot. She's really changed, and we want to move forward as a family." I didn't buy it. I'd heard their words before. It was always the same line they fed me, like I was supposed to just forgive and forget because it was time. But time didn't heal this kind of wound. It only deepened it. So when I walked in that night and saw her sitting at the table, looking like nothing had ever happened, I felt a fire start to burn inside me. She looked so innocent, so calm, like she had never torn my life apart. I could see the guilt in my parents' eyes, though. They hoped I would forgive her. I saw it in the way they watched me, waiting for my reaction. It was like they didn't even realize how deeply I had been scarred by the way they had forced me to share my life with her again. I could feel the pressure building as I stood there, my heart pounding. The familiar sense of betrayal came rushing back. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a test. They wanted me to cave in, to be the one who would fix the family. They wanted me to pretend like nothing had ever happened and to just slide back into some version of the family I had before. But I wasn't that person anymore. And that's when I knew. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me fall into their trap. They wanted me to forgive and forget, to let everything go as if it was nothing, as if it didn't matter. But it did matter. The hurt, the lies, the broken trust, it all mattered. And they were about to learn that some things can never be undone. As I walked out, the cold air biting at my skin, I felt a strange sense of peace. They were shocked, maybe even angry, but I couldn't keep pretending. It was over, and I wasn't going to be anyone's pawn anymore. Not theirs, not my sister's, and certainly not my ex-fiancé's. And for once I felt in control. But I knew deep down that walking away wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning of something bigger. Something I wasn't sure I was ready for. Because once you start peeling back the layers of betrayal, there's no going back. And who knows what they would do to try to fix what they had broken. Kept saying, "It's time to put this all behind you." My dad was even more insistent, his voice almost pleading, like he had something to prove. And maybe in a way he did. He knew the family was falling apart, that the rift between me and my sister had grown too deep. They wanted to fix things, to pretend like everything was okay again. They couldn't see it, they couldn't understand why I couldn't just forgive and forget. I was reluctant, but part of me, just a small part, wondered if they might be right. Could I really hold on to this anger forever? But every time I thought about walking into that house and sitting across from my sister, the image of her face, the same face that had once been my closest companion, flashed in my mind. That memory of betrayal felt fresh again, raw and sharp. I told myself it was too soon, that I wasn't ready, but my parents pushed harder. They had their ways of making you feel guilty. "We just want a family dinner," they'd say. "One last chance to be together." Eventually I gave in. Maybe it was the pressure, or maybe I just wanted peace in my life again, but I agreed. I walked into their house, expecting the usual awkwardness that always followed whenever they tried to bring us together. But when I saw my sister sitting there at the table, the same cold expression on her face, I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. The dinner started off as if nothing had changed. Small talk, the usual pleasantries, except I couldn't ignore the tension hanging in the air. My sister didn't even make eye contact with me. She barely spoke. And then there was my mom trying to fill the silence with chatter, desperately making it seem like everything was normal. But it wasn't normal. It never could be again. I tried to focus on the food, to pretend that this wasn't happening, but my thoughts kept swirling back to the past. The night I found out everything, the way they all acted like nothing was wrong. My sister's face when I confronted her, the way she looked at me like I was the problem. It was like she had no understanding of how much she'd broken, how much she'd taken from me. And then it happened. My dad, sensing the quiet crackling tension, broke the silence. "We think it's time you two talk," he said. "It's been years. Maybe it's time for you to forgive her." His voice wasn't angry, but there was an edge to it, almost as if he was daring me to do what he thought was right. I felt my heart race, the pressure mounting. I could feel my sister's eyes on me now, and it was as if everything was boiling over. She wasn't saying anything, but I could see her expression. A mixture of guilt and defiance. She wanted me to say something. She wanted me to forgive her. My mom chimed in, trying to soften the moment. "It's for the family, honey. Don't you want to heal things? Move forward." I stared at them both. The urge to scream, to demand they understand what she had done, almost overwhelmed me. But I kept my composure. I looked at my sister, who still couldn't meet my eyes, and then back at my parents. My heart was pounding, and for a moment I felt like I might snap. The words were right there, ready to burst out of me. But I didn't say a thing. Instead, I stood up, my chair scraping sharply against the floor, breaking the silence. I felt their eyes on me, and for a second I thought they might beg me to stay, beg me to forgive her. But I didn't give them that chance. I turned to walk out, not looking back once. I could hear my mom's voice calling after me, asking me to come back, telling me this wasn't how it was supposed to end. But I kept walking. I had no more words to say. All that was left was the undeniable truth that some betrayals go too deep, and no dinner, no apology could ever erase that. "Look at me." She kept her eyes on her plate, her posture stiff, like she was avoiding some invisible confrontation. My parents, oblivious to the storm brewing, chatted about anything but the elephant in the room. I could barely focus on their words. My mind was racing, torn between the urge to get up and walk out, and the guilt of knowing they wanted something from me, something that felt impossible to give. The dinner passed in painful silence, with only the clinking of silverware filling the gaps. And then, just as I was about to excuse myself and end the evening, my mother stood up. Her voice trembled slightly as she looked at me. "I know this isn't easy," she said, almost as if she were speaking to herself, "but we really need to talk about your sister." I froze. The tension in the room shifted from awkward to unbearable. My heart started to pound. I glanced at my sister, whose face had gone pale. For a moment I thought maybe she was going to speak, maybe she'd finally admit to the weight of her actions. But no, she just sat there, silent, as if waiting for the inevitable. That's when my mother dropped the bombshell. "I don't know how to say this," she began, and my mind immediately went into overdrive. "But your sister has been going through something. Something serious. We didn't want to tell you this, but she didn't just hurt you. She's been living with the consequences of her actions, too." I felt my stomach turn. Was she trying to make me feel sorry for her? Was this some kind of manipulation, an attempt to get me to lower my guard? My sister's face was flushed now, her lips trembling. It was clear she didn't expect this either. "The truth is," my mom continued, "your sister, she lost everything. Her marriage ended because of what happened. She's been struggling with guilt, and she was hoping that somehow you could understand." I felt a chill creep down my spine. My sister's marriage? She'd been married for a few years after everything went down, but I hadn't heard much from her since. I'd assumed she moved on just like everyone else. But the way my mom said it, it was like a shot to the chest. What was she really trying to tell me? My sister finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes. I'm not asking you to forgive me, but I'm asking for a chance. A chance to make things right." The words hung in the air, like they were pulling at something deep inside me. For a moment I almost wanted to reach out, to give in. But then the old anger, the memories of everything that had happened, came rushing back. I couldn't. I just couldn't let myself be dragged into this web of guilt and half apologies. But just as I was about to voice my response, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The timing couldn't have been worse, but as I glanced down at the screen, my heart skipped a beat. It was a message from my ex-fiancé. The message was simple, yet it sent a shock through my entire body. "We need to talk. I'm sorry, I never should have let it happen the way it did. Can we meet?" I froze. The room seemed to spin, and my sister's face seemed to blur as everything inside me snapped. The past, the betrayal, the lies, it was all crashing down at once. What was I supposed to do now? This wasn't just about my sister anymore. This wasn't just about forgiveness. There were so many pieces of the past I hadn't even begun to confront, and now it seemed like they were all coming back, demanding answers. Moment of manipulation? But my mother wasn't finished. "Your sister. She didn't just lose you that night. She lost everything. Her career, her health, her future. She's been in therapy, she's tried to get help, And I know it's been hard on you, but please understand what she did. It's been eating her alive. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. For a split second my anger softened, just enough to let in a sliver of doubt. Could it be true? Could she really have been suffering all this time? I looked at my sister, her face flushed, eyes wide with what I could only describe as guilt, maybe even fear. It was the first time I had seen any real emotion from her. But I didn't know if that meant anything anymore. I stood up, my heart racing. So, you think I'm supposed to forgive her now? My voice was louder than I intended, but I couldn't contain it. After everything? After how she destroyed my life? You want me to just forget all that because she's suffering? You can't seriously expect me to do that. My mother's face fell, and my father, who had been quiet the whole time, finally spoke up. We just thought it was time for you both to move on. But then, before I could say anything else, my sister stood up. For the first time in years, she looked me in the eye. Her voice cracked when she spoke. I never asked for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know. I never meant for any of it to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. But I was so lost, and I thought you'd never find out. I was stunned. The words I had been waiting for, hoping for, were finally here. But they didn't feel like they'd fix anything. They felt hollow, too little, too late. I wanted to scream, to tell her everything that had been eating away at me for years, but something inside me stopped. I realized that her apology, no matter how heartfelt, couldn't undo what had been done. And then, as I was about to turn and leave, my mother said something that would change everything. You think this is bad? You think your sister is the only one who made a mistake? There's something we haven't told you. Something you need to know, something that might make you rethink everything. My heart stopped. The way my mother said it, it wasn't just the usual drama. It was serious. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice trembling. She took a deep breath and looked at my father, who nodded, confirming her next words. The reason your sister did what she did. The reason she betrayed you. She paused as if gathering strength. Your fiancé wasn't the only one she was seeing. I froze. My mind couldn't process it at first. What did she mean? My fiancé wasn't the only one? My pulse quickened. What are you saying? I whispered. My mother's face twisted in regret, her words sinking in like a heavy weight. She was in a relationship with your best friend too. She wasn't just trying to take what was yours. She was trying to destroy everything you had. And the worst part? She succeeded. My knees almost gave out. It wasn't just betrayal from one person. It was two. I was blindsided, betrayed by the people I had trusted the most. And in that moment, as the walls of my reality came crashing down, I knew I had no choice but to leave. To walk away from everything I thought I knew. I turned to my sister, whose face was now pale with shock and shame, and I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not sadness, but pity. Pity for the girl who had tried so hard to tear my life apart, only to destroy her own in the process. I turned and walked out the door, but as I did, something inside me clicked. It wasn't over, not for me. I had reclaimed my life in that one decision. But little did I know, the truth wasn't finished with me yet. I never asked for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know. I would never have done what I did if I had understood the consequences. I was selfish. I wasn't thinking about how much you meant to me, how much everything would fall apart. I hurt you in the worst way, and I've paid the price for that every single day. But please, I need you to know I never meant to destroy everything. I was lost. I was so lost. Her voice broke at the last words, and I could see the tremble in her hands as she clenched them into fists. For the first time there was rawness in her eyes, real pain. Not the cold indifference that had defined her for so long. It hit me like a wave, knocking me off balance. The woman standing in front of me now wasn't the same one who had betrayed me. The years had changed her. The reality of what she'd done had broken her in ways I couldn't have imagined. But still, a part of me recoiled. The scar ran too deep. The damage wasn't just about what had happened. It was everything that had followed. My entire life had been twisted because of that one act of betrayal. The years I spent mourning, questioning my worth, doubting myself, it was more than just an incident. It was a life shattered. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I was lost in the intensity of the moment. My parents stood by, watching us, their expressions filled with a mix of guilt and hope. They had finally realized they couldn't play mediator anymore. This was between me and her. I don't know what you want from me, I said softly, trying to steady my breath. You want me to forgive you? To act like everything is okay again? I don't know if I can do that. I don't want you to forgive me, she replied, stepping closer. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I'll spend my life regretting it. And I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything. But I'm here now, and I'm not asking for redemption. Just understanding. Maybe that's the only thing I can hope for. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt like time had frozen. My mind was a battlefield torn between the anger I'd carried for years and the understanding that maybe, just maybe, people could change. But could I allow myself to believe that? Could I open myself to the possibility that what had happened might not define us forever? Then something shifted inside me. A small, quiet voice in my head told me that forgiveness didn't have to mean forgetting. That healing didn't mean pretending the past never happened, but choosing to step forward despite it. It wasn't about erasing the hurt. It was about accepting that life was messy, that people, my sister, my family, were flawed. And maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. But I wasn't ready to let it go entirely. I had suffered too much, carried this weight for far too long to just drop it in an instant. The truth was, my sister's apology wasn't enough to fix everything. It wasn't about the words, or even about her regrets. It was about how I had to rebuild myself after everything had fallen apart. I had built a life without her in it. One where I didn't have to face the ghost of that betrayal every day. I'm not ready, I said, my voice low but steady. I can't just forgive you because you're sorry. It's going to take time, a lot of time. I paused, feeling the weight of my own words. And maybe it's too late. Maybe we're too broken to ever be what we were. I could see the pain flash across her face. It wasn't just disappointment, it was a kind of acceptance. She nodded slowly, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of peace in her eyes. Not resolution, not a happy ending, but the kind of quiet acceptance that comes with realizing that sometimes, life just isn't fair. I understand, she whispered. I really do. It wasn't a perfect moment. It wasn't a grand reunion with tears and hugs. There were no easy answers. The years between us, the hurt, the betrayal, those weren't things that could be erased overnight. But in that room with my family standing by, I realized something. The worst part of betrayal isn't the act itself. It's the way it leaves you questioning everything, everyone. It's the way it makes you lose sight of who you are and who you could be. As I turned to leave, I felt a strange kind of release. The weight in my chest, the anger that had kept me in a constant state of grief, started to lift. I didn't know what the future held for my relationship with my sister. Maybe we'd never be as close as we once were. Maybe we'd never find a way back to the bond we'd had. But I also knew that whatever happened, I wouldn't let this define me. I wasn't going to let my past destroy my future. Walking out the door, I didn't feel triumphant, but I felt lighter. The world hadn't magically healed, but I had taken the first step toward my own healing. The journey wouldn't be quick and it wouldn't be easy, but it was mine to take. As I got into my car, I took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill my lungs. Life was never as simple as we wanted it to be. It was messy. It was complicated. But sometimes that's where the real strength came from. Not in holding on to the past, but in choosing to step forward, even when you didn't have all the answers. And as the engine hummed to life and I drove away, I knew one thing for sure. Forgiveness wasn't about fixing someone else's mistakes. It was about finding peace within yourself. And that for now was enough.